Hello everyone. In today's video I'm going to be going over how I painted this vintage brass HON3 steam locomotive. The first step of the process was to disassemble the model. Here you can see me removing the cover plate that holds the drivers in the frame. The tender also has to be disassembled, and here you can see me removing the trucks from the tender. The tender body was held on by 4 screws, which were pretty easy to remove. At this point, the model was completely disassembled, and I wanted to keep track of where all the screws came from so that I knew where they would go when I was reassembling the model. When you're looking at a brass locomotive and you see that gold or brass color, that isn't really the surface of the brass. That's a varnish that's applied at the factory to give the model a more uniform appearance and to cover the soldering. All of the original lacquer had to be removed if I wanted to keep all of the detail looking really sharp when I applied my own paints. I let the model soak in clean strip paint and varnish stripper for 24 hours. Once it was removed, I could scrub off the original varnish with a paintbrush and a toothbrush, as well as any residual material left from the varnish stripper. It took a good while to wash all of that material away. This had to be done to every part that was devarnished. At this point, I let the parts soak in vinegar to etch them. This will make it easier for the paint to adhere to the model. And with all of that varnish removed, you can really see what the raw brass actually looks like, as well as all the various solder joints. These are all of the parts after being completely devarnished. Here I'm cutting off the Ridgeway spark arrestor so that it would be a little bit easier to paint the smoke box. I also wanted to shorten the smokestack. One of the goals with this model was to attach a Colorado and Southern plow to it, so I got one from Overland Models and attached it to the original frame after I cut off the pilot. I also sanded down the boiler saddle so that the boiler would sit closer to the frame, which is a more prototypical look for Colorado and Southern locomotives. I reassembled the locomotive partially so that I could ensure that my modifications didn't affect its ability to roll. So here we have the Colorado and Southern brass locomotive being dragged along by a Blackstone K27. At this point in the project, I decided to put in an LED light. And to do this, you have to drill 2 holes in the model, one in the headlight casing and one on the top of the boiler, so that you can feed that LED wire to the motor. I also decided to add other prototypical details that were absent from the model originally, including wood planking on the tender frame. A lot of Colorado and Southern tenders had this particular feature. In addition, there was a superstructure assembly that I created for this tender on the front that you can see made from sheet styrene. The next step was to cover any areas that were conducive for electrical contact prior to painting. It's very important that these areas don't get covered in paint so that the model is able to pick up power from the tracks. This is especially true of the wheel treads, which you can see are getting covered with Vallejo liquid mask in this clip. And here we have all of the parts with either Tamiya tape or the Vallejo mask. Before painting the model, I dusted it off using an empty airbrush. So I just had air spraying the model basically to get off any dust. I then used Tamiya Fine Surface Primer to prime the model. It's a good idea to use an airbrush for this process. I regret using the spray can because I think it affected the texture somewhat negatively. Fortunately, the overall appearance by the end of the project was okay, but if I were to do this again, I would not use a spray can and would use some kind of primer from an airbrush instead. And so all of the parts were primed with the exception of the drivers. You want to make sure that when you're priming a brass model that you're applying the primer in a thin mist. You don't really want to saturate each of the parts with primer. I did this on a few of the parts, and I had to actually go back and put them in the varnish stripper again so that I could come back and put a thinner layer of primer on as to not obscure any of the rivet detail. This was particularly true of the tender shell. Once the model was primed, it was time to apply paints to it. I decided to paint the areas that were in need of a graphite color at first, since these were easier to mask before painting the rest of the model black. I used Vallejo flat aluminum for the smoke box and firebox areas. I was really happy with this color. It was slightly glossy, but not overly so. The smokestack and smokestack base also had to be painted with this color. I wanted to wait a few days before masking all of the parts painted with Vallejo flat aluminum, so I decided to do some wiring while letting the paint dry. In this clip, I am soldering these wires onto the Northwest short-line motor. These wires came with the LED lights that I ordered for the headlight, and they were really great because of their small size, and they were very well suited for wiring this very small motor. Here you can see me insulating the contact. The rest of the parts were painted with Vallejo flat black. I learned an important lesson here to mind the angle of your airbrush when you're painting a model, or at least to cover the cup, otherwise this might happen. That could have easily dropped onto the trucks and made quite a mess that would have necessitated a strip down again of all the paint. Once all the parts were painted with flat black, I went over them with Tamiya flat coat to help seal the paint. It's also my hope that this will protect the paint during any handling in the future, but I do intend to wear gloves whenever I handle this model. Here you can see the liquid mask being removed from the tender trucks. It's really important to remove this stuff within 2 or 3 days of putting it on the model. I learned this the hard way. A lot of the liquid mask had hardened into a really unworkable resin, and it was very difficult to remove. Here the tender frame is receiving paints. Whenever I was painting a part, I wanted to spray past the model in both directions so that there wouldn't be an accumulation of paint in the center. You notice how my airbrush is moving in a line that is parallel to the model, essentially, so this prevents any paint buildup. After a few days, I felt that the Vallejo flat aluminum was sufficiently dry, so I started masking the smokebox area with Tamiya tape, avoiding the headlight and the smokebox number plate. I wanted those to be black. And I very carefully started painting the boiler and cab of the locomotive. I also wanted to leave the handrails on the smokebox uncovered so that they would be painted black as well. Removing the Tamiya masking tape was one of the scariest parts of the painting process for me. I was really concerned that the tape would lift some of the paint from the smoke box, but fortunately this did not happen. It came off very easily, and none of the flat aluminum was lifted by the tape, so that was really great to see. This is what the boiler and cab looked like once the paint had been removed, or the tape had been removed rather. I added a little bit of weathering to the sides of the smoke box, and here you can see the tender shell or body receiving its coat of Vallejo flat black. This is the frame and plow receiving paints. I had covered the areas where the driver axles met the frame with Vallejo liquid mask, again to ensure that there was good electrical contact when I put the model back together. But it became so difficult to remove this on this part that uh, I ended up risking damaging my finished paint job. So I had to use a good deal of Goo Gone and rubbing alcohol to carefully remove the the dried out liquid mask from this part. Unfortunately, I didn't ruin the paint and have to start over. Once all the parts were painted, I could apply the Colorado and Southern decals, which officially made this a specific Colorado and Southern locomotive. Here you can see the reassembled tender with its new decals. Now that the model was completely painted and all the decals were applied, it was time to finish the remotoring process. I had to solder one of the wires onto a little piece that connected to the drawbar, and then the other wire was soldered onto the engineer's side of the frame. Reassembling the drawbar was very challenging in this particular part. I attached some leads to the drawbar and the bottom of the frame to make sure that the engine still worked or the motor still worked, and it fortunately did. I also attached wires for the LED headlight to the drawbar and the engineer's side of the frame. In this clip, I'm using tweezers to carefully pull the LED wires through the hole that I made in the headlight casing and the top of the boiler. It's worth noting that the resistor on one of the wires is way too large to fit through the tiny holes in the headlight and the top of the boiler. Because of this, I had to cut off the resistor and then resolder it once the LED had been pulled through the boiler. Here, one of the wires is being soldered onto the wire which was already connected to the engineer's side of the frame. I made sure to cover up any soldered connections with heat shrink tubing. Here you can see the resistor kind of on the right side of the screen. Once all the wiring was finished, I ran a lead test to make sure that the headlight and motor were operating simultaneously. I was very happy to see that they were. At this stage, it was time to start reassembling the model. This was a really scary step for me. I was worried that I might scratch the paint with a screwdriver or that I might drop the model and scuff it in some way. I was also really worried about how the model would operate on track once it was put on. I'd heard many stories about how difficult it can be to get a brass model running again once you've painted it. You also have to mind the way that you reassemble a brass model. These engines have insulated and uninsulated drivers. All of the insulated drivers have to be on one side of the frame. And in this particular clip, I put the drivers on the wrong side. They were basically backwards, so I had a mixture of insulated and uninsulated wheels on one side of the frame. So the center driver was different from the outer two, basically, with the way that I had put it on, and that prevented the engine from running initially. And it took me a couple days to realize that. It was very frustrating, but it was a simple fix. Here you can see the finished locomotive with the drivers put on properly. In addition to painting this model, I added some details to make it a bit more historically accurate, including the bell and whistle cords, which are made from stretched melted plastic, essentially. I also added a new brass casting for the whistle. The last detail that I added was a coal load for the tender. I mixed white glue and rubbing alcohol along with some water, and then poured a bit of this really finely ground coal that I bought on eBay onto the tender. I then used a pipette to cover this with the mixture of glue and rubbing alcohol. You also want to put a light layer of coal on the very top of the glue so that you don't have a really glossy, uniform texture on your coal load. This here is a full view of the finished tender. You can really see in this clip the added details and just how nicely the styrene ends up blending with the brass once everything is painted. With the model finally finished, it was time to put it on the track. And this is footage of the first successful run of the model when it was fully painted. I let the engine run light on my layout a few times before I added any rolling stock. I have a pretty challenging layout. It's based off of the Georgetown Loop in Colorado, which this locomotive would have run on in its career. The Georgetown Loop is a difficult line in real life. It has rather steep grades of 3 to 4%, as well as pretty tight turns. My layout is similar in this regard. All of the grades are 3%, and I have curves that have less than an 18-inch radius. So I was really happy to see that this locomotive could traverse the grade and make it around all the curves. There are a couple areas where the power is a little bit spotty. It's not the most efficient runner in terms of electrical draw, but it does run fairly smoothly and fairly quietly for a brass model. It's really important that you lubricate brass models because of all of the metal on metal contacts with the gears and the worm. So I'll close out this video with just some shots of the engine running on my layout. I bought a kit off of eBay of Colorado and Southern Combine car number 20. It's an amazing kit, and I've included a link to that kit in the description. I also got a Microtrains Colorado and Southern gondola. This consist is based off of the preserved consist behind locomotive number 71, which is on display in Central City, Colorado. That was also part of the Colorado and Southern line. This is unfortunately the last time that this layout might appear on film. I'm going to be moving in a couple of weeks back to Colorado, actually, and I'm not sure if this layout is going to be able to come with me. So I hope you all enjoy these final shots of this really fun layout that I built over the course of a couple of years. It was really nice to have at least one Colorado and Southern train running on this line. All of my HON3 equipment up to this point was Blackstone equipment, which is all Rio Grande stuff, and that was really fun to run on this layout as well. But I'm happy that I could get some footage of a more prototypical train going around the Georgetown Loop. As a potentially final farewell to this layout, we'll track Colorado and Southern number 8 as it goes around the loop. Here you can see it about to cross the first bridge over Clear Creek heading west. As it rounds this curve, it's going to approach the Lebanon mine, which survives to this day. You can visit it if you ride the Georgetown Loop. Here we're passing one of the retaining walls, the stone retaining walls, which you can still see a few of them along Clear Creek and the Georgetown Loop. As we round this curve, number 8 is about to cross the Devil's Gate High Bridge. It's about 100 feet over Clear Creek in real life. Coming down now, the 3% grade, the locomotive picks up a bit of speed as gravity helps its descent. Now crossing the third bridge over Clear Creek. In reality, the loop would be getting higher in elevation at this point, but I had it loop back down so that I could have a continuously running layout. This is definitely an abstraction and an imagined version of the Georgetown loop, but I think it captures the spirit pretty okay. And this bridge here is rather fictional. We're now at a level area of track once more, and the locomotive is about to prepare to climb the loop once again as it crosses under the Devil's Gate High Bridge. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you find it helpful in your efforts to paint your own brass locomotives and rolling stock. This was the first brass model that I have ever painted, and I learned a lot of important lessons here that I'll certainly carry with me if I attempt to paint another model like this. It was a much more challenging project than I expected. Expect more Titanic content coming from this channel in the near future, but in the meantime, we'll have a final look at the small Georgetown loop layout and the Colorado and Southern consist that finally got the chance to run on it. Take care and happy modeling.